England, you won't need me to tell you that it's been another scorching day, a high of 33 degrees as parts of the UK hit the peak of their fourth heat wave of the year. But as things heat up, some cultural institutions are shutting down. It's becoming increasingly common to see galleries and museums partially or fully close in order to keep staff, visitors, volunteers and the exhibits safe. Earlier I spoke to Doug Gurr, Director of the Natural History Museum in London, whose website today warns that during hot weather some of our galleries can get quite warm and may be closed. And to Ben Millam, founder of Mortis Consulting, who's been keeping a tracker of the effects of the heat wave on the sector and told me what his spreadsheet reveals.
Particularly this year with the weather that we've seen more closures than ever before. We've tracked in previous years. So examples being institutions like Birmingham Museum completely closing down for days on end, Young V&A in Bethnal Green. Also, we saw a lot of the larger institutions, places like the British Museum, closing some galleries as a result of heat. And a number of them changing operating hours, places like Stonehenge actually reducing their operating hours. So a significant wide impact right across the UK in terms of response to this, and probably more than we've seen previously.
Tell me what you found in Europe.
So across Europe, particularly in France, tracking places like the Louvre in Paris, other institutions kind of having full closures. And for these large institutions, that's a significant commitment and things that wouldn't be undertaken lightly.
Doug, it's 33 degrees in London today. It has been 37 degrees. The Natural History Museum is inside a magnificent Victorian building. Does that get very hot, or is there some protection from that? I'm wondering if you've been closing galleries this summer.
The answer is no, absolutely not. I mean, look, clearly we all, as you just heard from Ben, do need to think hard about how we adapt. And, we think, what does it mean for visitors? What does it mean for staff? What does it mean for collections? We've not had to close big spaces. We've had to be very thoughtful about particularly what we do is for some of the staff. We might say, there are areas where we don't want people standing where it's too hot. So we're very tactical and things. But generally, the museum's been open every day and we obviously keep it closely under control. Things do vary. But actually, a little bit like you probably recall not that long ago, we were talking about museums as warm spaces in winter. I think we also need to think of them as cool spaces in summer. So if you come to a gallery like Fixing Our Broken Planet or Jurassic Oceans or particularly our new gardens, that actually can be a lovely space. It's shady, it's cool, it's calm. And actually what we're seeing is visitors are really flocking to those spaces where, as long as they know it's there, if you can actually provide a nice, cool space, why wouldn't you?
But the advice that you give people visiting is carry water. That would not necessarily be advice, for example, in front of the Mona Lisa. So are you at an advantage because your exhibits are unbreakable, as it were?
I wish that were the case. We have many, many fragile exhibits as well. No, look, of course we have to be thoughtful, but like in these kind of hot times, and by the way, that goes as much for staff as it does for visitors.
Absolutely.
It's sun and cream, gazebos, wear a hat, carry water. We absolutely encourage visitors and we actually encourage staff to do it. Like all museums, you've got to be really thoughtful of how do you make sure you secure the collection and keep it well protected. But I always say these collections were there for a purpose. They're there to put on display. They're not just there to be locked away. So it's sort of on us to figure out how do we create a great visitor experience, let them have water when we possibly can, but do it in such a way that we, of course, make sure we don't compromise the safety and security of the collections.
Are there items in the collection which are vulnerable to extreme heat and which you wouldn't be having on display at particular times?
There absolutely are. So, for example, we have cryogenically frozen, the Darwin Tree of Life biological specimens. That can't really get hot because things go wrong. And we have actually had to take, as Ben was saying, so, we have a very clear adverse weather plan. We've been implementing that. That's about staff welfare. It's about visitor welfare, but it's also about collections care. And we do at times have to restrict access to particularly those collections that are very, very temperature sensitive, spirit collections and so on.
Well, obviously, Doug was saying that he's been keeping open, but there have been issues for staff in other institutions, whether they can get access to water, about what they wear, about the conditions inside for them.
So it's really critical that organisations think about this, and a number of them are doing this already. So when it comes to particularly around staff and volunteer welfare, is paramount in terms of how everybody operates. So we're seeing organisations operate different shift patterns, having a higher rotation of staff in particularly hot areas, thinking about the clothing they're wearing. But it's really important that they're thinking about how those staff and volunteers can operate on site and also get to site, because one of the things we talk about are the direct impacts, but also the indirect impacts of things like transport infrastructure. So it's all very well and good opening your doors, but if the public transport infrastructure is impacted, you may have staff, volunteers and visitors struggling to get to site as well.
So, Doug, to other museums, would you say that how much of a role in closure does the architecture of a building play?
I think it has a massive role, and this has been a bit of a wake-up call for us this summer. We've known this is coming. The extreme weather isn't a thing. It is actually, and you mentioned Victorian buildings. We've been having some really interesting conversations with the team about saying, actually, one of the ways we make it work is the Victorians were pretty good at using airflow and evaporative cooling. So actually, if you think about our main Hinsey Hall, actually what we've done in the hot weather is we just throw open the doors. We've actually undone some of the, if I can use the phrase, craziness of the 1970s that blocked off all the air vents. And of course, we have to do this in a way that's fire safe, etc. But we can actually now pull cool air in, make it rise and go out the roof. And actually that way, without spending a fortune on burning fossil fuels to put air conditioning in, we think actually putting in nature-based solutions, cooling, greening cities has to be the way forward.
So in a way, Ben, what's happening is some museums are thriving on this and some museums are not. Some museums are seeing numbers fall. If you can't afford a closure, I mean, what happens to, for example, small regional museums working on a very tight budget who are unable to afford closure? I mean, what is the best response?
There's some interesting data recently from the Association of Cultural Enterprises that said that the visitor figures for their members were down 10% compared to June last year. And for a number of organisations, they're seeing visitor numbers actually drop when we get to extreme heat. So getting people through the doors can be a challenge itself. I think what we're seeing across the sector for a number of organisations is a lot of them are running very thin in terms of resources. And when we hit a point of pressure, like something like a heat wave, we're seeing impacts, but it just happens to be a heat wave. But there are other adverse weather conditions. There are rising costs of utilities, as Doug mentioned there. So I think what we're seeing in the heat waves is actually hitting a bit of a pressure point in terms of the way that they operate. But as Doug said, I think there's a lot of opportunities to think about the use of technology to let the buildings work by themselves, to think about how they can operate more passively. And one of the wonderful things about the sector is that these are organisations that think in the long term, that they have been around for a significant period of time. They work in a different time frame to a lot of other organisations, so they're able to think and work forward in those time sets as well.
Well, let's look at other areas of the world, particularly wildfires across France and Spain at the moment. What is the threat level there? Because you do look at Europe, and are any museums and cultural institutions actually at risk? I mean, we know that the fires were, whatever it was, 19 kilometres from Bordeaux.
Yeah, so we're tracking that across Europe. Fortunately, touch wood, at the moment, we haven't seen any museums directly impacted, but we have seen full and partial closures, particularly as a relation to the smoke. So you don't have to be as a victim of the fire to be a victim of the impacts of it. So smoke issues. And what we're seeing in Europe, and the UK needs to start thinking about this because it feels like that's kind of Southern Europe. This is where we are in 10 years' time. And looking to places like California and Australia and the lessons learned there is something that wildfire impacts we are going to have to think about.
So they have particular plans in place for that, for example, in Cairo or in Istanbul or in Texas or indeed in Sydney.
Yeah, so a lot of that's around kind of protection of the collection. So it's closing sites down, it's fire protection, it's particularly on ventilation and air quality in relation to caring for the collection. So they really shut down. If you've seen the Getty Institute in near LA, they had wildfires up to the doors and they have protections and significant amount of resources go into protecting those. So it's a really key issue that we're beginning to think about.
But of course, the Getty is very well endowed.
Yes, it is. But so this is the planning that needs to come in. And for all these organisations, it might be planning for wildfire, but they have to plan for business continuity regardless of what the impacts are. But wildfire will be an issue here.
Doug, it seems that natural history is doing well. Can some museums turn this to their advantage? For example, serving as kind of refuges in heat. But also, I seem to remember we used to have more nights at the museum. I mean, that was done, but obviously not for reasons of heat before.
No, and I think the short answer is yes. And look, you're spot on, Kirsty. And, my heart goes out to institutions around all four nations of the UK that are struggling. We know money's tight, we know pressures are on. I do think there are some opportunities, though, as you say. It's amazing how much difference it makes if you come in early morning, late evening. So our garden board volunteers now start earlier when it's not so hot. We love doing evening events. And, if I'm allowed a little plug, if you want to come and do yoga underneath the blue whale or dinosaurs, kids and adults, separate events, etc., you can do all of these things. And I know there's brilliant innovation all around the country going on. And one thing maybe I particularly point to that I'm personally very excited about is we've just started rolling out with a whole bunch of sort of museums all around the country, smaller museums, more regional museums, partly through the Real World Science Network. How can we start to create that, what I call indoor-outdoor experience? Because we know that when visitors arrive, these days we're not used to spending 2 hours standing on our feet in a hot, stuffy thing. You just want to relax. Your kids want to run around. You want somewhere to sit down. I just think if you can do that with a little bit of come and spend the day, particularly in a hot summer, a bit in, a bit side, isn't that kind of what our museums are meant to be for? Places of refuge, cool in the summer, Warm in the winter.
So finally, Ben, do you think this is going to lead to, over the next decade, you talked about it, but perhaps even earlier in that, a kind of reconfiguration as to what the museum experience might be?
We're going to have to prepare for this being the norm going forward. Some organisations will be able to adapt, some will have to deal in closures. So I think having rolling programmes of closures related to kind of heat alerts in future summers is going to be the normal pattern that we get used to. And it's something in terms of our experience of culture, visitors are going to have to think about.
Ben Mellon, founder of Mortis Consulting, and Doug Gurr, director of the Natural History Museum.